Hello, everybody. It's good to see you again, back with another episode from the Economancer, the High Priest of the Economicon. Today, we're going to be watching a video on the paradoxes of neoliberalism, and I'm going to give some of my criticisms on this kind of totality of ideas that's going to be presented. Because though I do think that there are some benefits that can be gained through, I guess you could say, postmodern interpretation and critical theory as well, uh, being brought into capitalism and stuff like that. These specific paradoxes that are going to be brought up, I don't think they're as valid as these individuals may think. And I also think that they may be something that, for those who don't know, might have a better idea on what the current state and development of these grievance courses and stuff like that, and what they're teaching to the youth. Because again, there's nothing wrong with criticizing something. In fact, everyone should criticize every system that exists. This is what Nietzsche did, as well as all the other philosophers, so on and so forth. They criticize, but what is the utility gained by that? Criticism is something that we have to bring in. Now, with this, I want to point out a few things. This is going to be a pretty hard-lined criticism. So I hope you enjoy it. This is going to be a fairly long video because this video itself is 20 minutes. And if anybody's seen my 30-minute excavation into a 5-minute Robert Wolf video, you'll know that this is going to be quite some time. But I'm going to try to limit it and try to make my arguments as succinct as possible. And we'll see how I do about that. So let us begin.
I think to understand neoliberalism, we need to think of it as a set of paradoxes. And I think there are three major paradoxes to look at. The first one is really how neoliberalism likes to position itself as an amoral orientation. That is not about morality, it's about market principle, it's about rational calculation. And yet, if you look at how it's contextualized on the ground, you see that it ushers in a lot of conservative moral agenda about family, about gender, about sexuality. So that's the first set of paradoxes.
Okay, just to kind of go into this, saying something is amoral, but it contextualizes a certain set of moral values and principles, does not necessarily mean that that thing is taking a moral stance. It just says that under the efficiency guidelines of neoliberalism, that's just what gets chosen as the most efficient. It doesn't mean that that is the preferred. It just means that just so happens to be the best given the conditions of neoliberalism. So I don't think that we'll get into it later, but that doesn't sound like a paradox to me.
The second set of paradoxes that I think we could identify is the depoliticization of social risks and the hyper politicization of national security. So, on one hand, you're supposed to be responsible for your own risk. You're supposed to encourage to take risks and then take responsibility for those risks. And it's not about the society, it's not about institutions, it's not about unequal distribution of resources, it's about yourself. On the other hand, there is this regime of fear about how the country is being invaded by immigrants, by foreign culture, political influences. So we need to strengthen our borders, we need more resources into national security. So the third
Okay, with this one, so the immigrant, foreign cultures, and others moving into our sphere for the sake of this discourse, this point is actually rebuffed a little bit later on, hilariously enough, under the same guise. And it just turns into like, so there's going to be an attack on free trade. And so this just turns into a good for thee, but not for me kind of argument. And it kind of makes this criticism point out what it actually is. It's not a criticism of free trade, and it's not a criticism of neoliberalism. It's essentially a criticism and ideological attack and subversion of Western structures that have been uh, set as the hegemon, right? And so that's kind of the issue that's going to be being brought up more so than there is any of the paradoxes. As you've seen, that doesn't necessitate a paradox. You can have two different sets of domestic and international guidelines, right? That's not paradoxical. You don't have to have a single system of governance within, a global structure.
Third set of paradoxes, I think, is on one hand, there is a continuous ravaging of vulnerable populations. On the other hand, there's the celebration of humanitarian or human rights intervention. So because neoliberalism really polarizes distribution of wealth and resources. And yet, at the same time, there is this expansion of humanitarianism globally. And so the two seems to be, rather than a set of solutions for a set of problems, they grow symbiotically together.
Okay, so before we jump into, because they're going to bring in other guests to talk about these specific paradoxes and their work within them. So when we're talking about like ravaging vulnerable populations as it being a mode of being for the neoliberalism, all modes of being in human civilization throughout time have, ravaged vulnerable populations. In fact, if we look at the current regimes, China is by far the most ravaging of vulnerable populations. Look at what it's doing to Africa. Look at what it's doing to Afghanistan. Even in their, even into their own populations, it seems to be a very big issue about them taking advantage of vulnerable populations and extracting resources from them, right? And this isn't in the mode of like free trade that the West may do. This is a specific type of colonialism or imperialism that's being acted out and manifesting through China. Then we have to think, so why does the West have this like moral impetus to help out others despite this skewness of the distribution? Well, if I grant your argument that, neoliberalism creates this unequal distribution, and then we also had colonialism for years, it would stand to reason that you would want to have a moral reevaluation of your society that says, okay, we have to deal with these issues that we in the past created. This is the white man's burden, the white man's guilt, whatever you want to call it. There's a great book by William Easterly that talks about this, about the failures of this, right? Because there was a giant failure in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s regarding, IMF loans and restructuring and stuff like that. But the point is that there was a moral impetus of moving into this, and that was just formulated by, looking at the past grievances and trying to correct for that. So there's a reason why it's doing that, and it's facilitated by neoliberalism and the growth of wealth that's accumulated by the West. And yet we don't see this similar pattern in other places. And I get this is like a whataboutism kind of argument, but the point is we have to have some comparisons, so that we can, come to this conclusion. I mean, even if I grant all of the arguments, you would still want to redistribute, not out of a paradox, but out of a pragmatic evaluation of political discourse and expedience. So before we move in, there's going to be a lot of words that are going to be used throughout this, right? So first and foremost, neoliberalism is not going to be defined. There's a separate video that's 9 minutes long that goes into how they're defining it. But at the end of the day, there's really no true quote unquote statement on what is neoliberalism, because it manifests itself in multiple ways and in multiple discourses. It can be defined. And it's not something that I know of any work in. I mean, you can point to what Milton Friedman thought of as neoliberalism, which typically neoliberalism is laid at the feet of the Chicago School, right? But that doesn't necessarily come out to be true. All right, so in this regard, we're going to have some confusion and some equivocation fallacies that are going to be presented. And this is because there's going to be some inconsistency in defining a lot of the terms, which is common in critical theory, as you can see, and postmodernism. You can see Foucault in there in the back. So obviously, this language play is going to be rather important for a lot of this. And so in the context, a lot of these paradoxes, they're not like actually paradoxical. They're just not technically defined in the literature, and so you can kind of get away with saying certain things, but ultimately what they're trying to get at is like market-based principles in those interactions within a mixed economy.
So I think that we need to pay attention to these three sets of paradoxes in order to understand the complex operation of neoliberalism and how it affects people's lives.
What is the function of these wars that are being fought? And because you would think trying to cut government spending and lower deficits, why are these wars fought in Afghanistan and Iraq and Lord knows where next? There's no explanatory framework for that within the genealogy of neoliberalism that's really confined to what has happened in the global north. In order to understand that, to see how what those wars are about, and why it's okay to why the same people who advocate cutting spending for every kind of social service will advocate military spending over the roof, not just for the companies that make profit on producing goods for the military, but on what is the point of fighting these wars, right, in the first place, when they look on the surface to be utterly irrational from the point of view of neoliberal policy alone. That there's a broader context of neocolonialism and neo-imperialism and of post-colonialism. There are various shifting frames you can think of that expand that framework enough so that you can start talking about the connections between the ways that military spending fits with slicing a social safety net, and why how it is racialization works within the policies of neoliberalism.
Part of what
Okay, so first let's think about this. War as a function of neoliberalism, you said that it doesn't in fact work within the realm of neoliberalism. So that wouldn't be a paradox, that would be a contradiction. All right, so that would mean neoliberalism is actively contradicting itself, and that would be something along the lines of a Hegelian dialectic, right? But the problem is it's not contradictory and it's not paradoxical, because again, we have an internal versus an external view of our civilization, right? So when we're talking about war, especially within the United States, for most of its history, I guess you could say post World War II, really has maintained this neo-realism international relations strategy. Neo-realism is a opposing international view of opposing view of international relations. It's a rather powerful argument to be made that we're serving within the self-interest. So if your utility maximization equation, right, is focusing on only your population and your citizens, realism or neo-realism with neoliberalism together makes sense, because the goal is to maximize your population's utility function, right? So why would we invade another country? Well, we could say that, for example, let's give Iraq. Let's take the worst of the worst ideas about Iraq and say that it was a function to stop Iraq from moving the petrodollar towards OPEC and stuff like that. It is rational that the United States, looking out for its self-interest within its population and its population's utility function and the government's utility function, to intervene into Iraq to stop them from being able to do that. That is not paradoxical. That makes complete sense. Now, whether you agree that that is a moral outcome, that is another argument to be made. But to say that that in and of itself is a paradox doesn't make sense, because you're just trying to remove the defining function, which in this case, for both neoliberalism domestically and the international relations for war under neorealism, both of them are about the aggregate utility function. And so ultimately, cutting spending for social services, and then moving them towards something like, national defense. And that's a conversation we could have on what is better for an economy. There are some people that say, military spending, even though it's unnecessary, it still produces a lot of technological movement, and these technological movements tend to help out the population as a whole, so the spending isn't sunk costs. And then also there is a necessity for a government to guard its civilian population, and so you're going to have some level of spending regardless, and that is just a function of government in general. And you can have the debate on whether the government needs to intervene in the social welfare function, right? And those are two different arguments, but those ultimately come down to what is best for the population. And that is a political question as much as it is a economic question, because you can make the economic argument in both ways. You can say, well, we need to reduce spending and increase social welfare, and that way we'll have a broader base that has high human capital and stuff like that, and that makes sense. You can also say on the other end, well, we need to reduce social welfare and increase, this spending towards military, because the military industrial complex moves that technological frontier more forward than privatization, which I may not agree with, but I can understand the function of it, and that it is a necessary part of the government's job to interact for the population's sake against enemies that are foreign. That makes sense. So the level of spending here is really the conversation, and at the end of the day, that doesn't make it a paradox between neoliberalism and itself, right? Because it's not a self-defeating argument. There is not an internal contradiction, because the goal is to maximize the utility of the population, and that may be a difference in what your defining functions are, but that isn't in itself paradoxical or contradictory.
What it has meant to me in activism is a few things. A way of talking.
Okay, I do want to point out that this person has already stated that they are a scholar and an activist. And I find this strange, because you can be a scholar or you can be an activist. This kind of scholarship through activism, I'm not a huge fan. And I guess you could say I kind of do it myself, but I don't attach my name, my location, and my school or my job or anything like that with my work. It is independent of anything else. And this is something that, for all the attacks on Milton Friedman and stuff like that, he had for the majority of his career, kept his activism and his normative policies separate from his positive work in economics. So I don't really like the idea that someone's going to admittedly be an activist, but I mean, hey, you do you. Go for it, but let's see what you have to say.
Talking about what Lisa Dugan has called, a set of conditions that have produced an upward distribution of wealth. That's like a really key baseline for thinking about it. Like, what is this range of things that have happened? And when we're looking at that, domestically, we see things like growing wealth divide, stagnating wages, attacks on labor, attacks on welfare, and the dismantling of the minimal poverty alleviation programs the U.S. has. So sort of like worsening conditions, rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, and this drastic development.
Okay, so first of all, this is an empirically untrue claim, just flat out. I mean, I don't think that the disparity in the U.S. has grown. Wealth inequality has grown. Income inequality has grown. A lot of reasons for that. Technology frontiers being busted through. And, if you've watched any of my episodes, you've seen Schumpeter being talked about as this Schumpeterian engine of growth keeps moving forward. As these new technology frontiers get busted through, you're going to have a capture of those technological frontiers. As time comes in, it manages to go through. This is Kuznets and his income inequality and economic growth argument that it's inverted U-shaped, right? This has been tested for years and years. I mean, the empirical relationship isn't very clear. There's plenty of research that says yes, there is an income inequality, economic growth, inverted U-shaped. But at the same time, there are plenty of people who say, no, there's not. But at the end of the day, to say that things are getting worse, that's empirically untrue. And we'll get into that later.
Of what I call like apparatuses of racialized violence. Major expansion of criminalization, major expansion of immigration enforcement, militarized borders, more people locked in cages than ever anywhere on earth, right? Here in the United States right now. So those two things happening are really big. And then a third piece of it is that maybe is particularly interesting to me as a legal scholar and legal activist is.
I want to stop here real quick because there's a lot to be unpacked here and like complete amount. All right. So first and foremost, this has nothing to do with neoliberalism. This is just an attack again on the Western structure, just pointing to neoliberalism as the motive being for this. It doesn't make sense. You're not creating a connection. You're just saying these things are bad. You're just criticizing what is. And that's fine, but that doesn't give a causal connection between neoliberalism, neoliberalist policies, and these things happening, which I think you're going to be doing here real soon. But this isn't like a clear response on what's going on. So first, apparatus of racialized violence. This is where we get into like these word games. So what an apparatus is a tool. Racialized means of color, and violence means to inflict additional harm. I don't think that there's an increase in racialized violence, especially when we have comparisons to, say, the 1960s, which had vast amounts of legitimate racialized violence. Now, what I'm going to assume that this is associated with the high rates of incarceration in the United States. So let's talk about that. So first off, in the population, there's about 0.7 to about 0.7% of the U.S. population is in state, federal, or local jail in the United States, and it's roughly 25% of the world's total prison population, if you buy that, because the given population is something like I actually think it's right at 2 million, or actually maybe a little bit below that now at like 1.9 million of the population of the United States. Because this video is a little bit old. There's been some advancements. There's been a precipitous decline, or modest decline, a modest decline in overall incarceration rates in the U.S., and the racialized proportions have also declined in the U.S. So it's not as bad as it was in the 90s to the 2000s. And since 2009, it has decreased, though modestly, right? And so in the world rankings, we were number one at 2017, 2018, 2019, not so much. 2020, not even close. Which is really funny because if you look up, by nation ranking, all the ones that you'll see will say the U.S. as number one with 655 to 640, depending on the relationship, per 100,000 in prison, which puts us vastly ahead of everybody else. Given the 2020 numbers, it was something like 419 persons per 100,000, which actually puts us out of the top 10. Now, second, of all of these countries, hilariously enough, most of them are on the increase. A lot of the countries that have been pointed to for a long time to having these vast prison populations are actually decreasing. Places like Russia is having a decreasing prison population. The United States is having a decreasing prison population. And there has been a few researchers out there who've pointed towards this wave form of prison population and crime. You can look at the United States. A lot of places follow a Kuznets curve of crime. There's also the wave Kuznets form of crime that's, been looked at across, these historical trends that, there's times and places, these generational swings of violence and crime, and then these swings of high levels of incarceration. And then it also goes into what kind of regime you have, whether you have a more authoritarian regime or a more, freedom regime. In the United States, it flows along this way as well. So, yeah. And then to say that it is the most historically, it's just not true. There were 6 million Jews in internment camps. That was part of a prison population in Nazi Germany. And to try to play the game that the current U.S. prison population is anything like that is sickening to me. As well as, the Russian gulags and all of these places, or Cambodia, where 1/3 of the population was imprisoned and then slaughtered. To say what we have right now is somehow objectively as bad is gross and incorrect.
Is the ways that those things have happened during a period when supposedly we've all become declared equal under the law, right? During this period, the last 40 or 50 years, supposedly racism, sexism, ableism became illegal in the United States, and we have anti-discrimination laws and hate crimes laws, and there's been this sort of purported legal resolution of these long-term tensions, problems, violences, yet on the material level, those things have worsened and deepened with this growing poverty and growing criminalization and immigration enforcement.
Some theorists.
Again, that doesn't make any sense. That is empirically untrue. There is not the wealth disparities in the United States have shrunk since the time of the civil rights. They haven't made as big of gains, but they have shrunk. Right? That's objectively true. Secondly, the amount of violence that happened during the 80s and 90s, for whatever reason you want to point to, lack of collective efficacy, increased lead into our air through leaded gasoline and stuff like that. All of these things can be reasons for why this happened, and we're just feeling the knock-on effects now and trying to, again, correct, because there's always going to be a possible overcorrection, and then you have to go back and try to correct that problem that you've created, but you can't know that at the time. You can't assume to know the future, right? So that's a first and foremost. And so here's kind of the weird thing about this, like this racialization that I've kind of looked at is like, when it comes to this racialization aspect, this fundamentally misses the problems of this reduction of self-responsibility that they're pointing to as a neoliberal value, right? And that this self-responsibility is imposed on this population. Now, think about what this means from a logical conclusion. You're saying that this population does not know what self-responsibility is, does not act out in a responsible way, and that the violence isn't, or the racialized violence and incarceration rates aren't because of skin tone or because of their sexual preferences and stuff of like that, or their gender or anything like that. You're not saying that it's because of that. You're saying it's because they reject the neoliberal values because they can't act in them because they are not a part of the structure. That in and of itself is the definition of racism by by the racism of low expectations. Sorry, I'm struggling with that one because it's just so mind blowing to me that you have such low expectations for racial minorities and sexual and gender minorities that you think, oh well, just because they got all of these things, they're even worse now because they can't exist within the system as is because the system itself is still out to get them, despite the fact that they have quote unquote equality under the law, but they can't act it out. That in and of itself is racist to say that they can't act within these paradigms. And that's one of the big reasons why people call like critical race theory like highly racist, is because it tries to make the claim that racialized minorities cannot exist within the Western structure, and that since they have to live in the Western structure, it is this symbolic or epistemic violence that happens to them, and they can't do any better. And I think that that's gross because I completely disagree.
Have talked about the ways in which freedom is understood as consumer freedom for the middle classes, right? And then for less privileged people, freedom, ironically, can become, in some instances, literally equated with incarceration, right? So, which brings up an interesting question. What could be meant by freedom in this context? And let me just tell you a little bit about my own work, because I work with sex workers who've been declared or understood to be trafficking victims by secular and evangelical Christian activists who don't see this as paradoxical or oxymoronic. So in their view, through the prison, right, sex workers can be rehabilitated so that they can have freedom in a meaningful sense, right? So, and sex workers as well as the people who are understood to exploit them, right? And what's interesting about this makes you think, you know, what could this possibly mean is that in their view, freedom is not just doing anything at all, right? But freedom can only take place under conditions of constraint. So, the space of prison actually becomes a space of possibility where people can learn the necessary constraints so that they can exercise meaningful freedoms, right? The same thing. The same dynamics are also operative in the incarceration of people who are arrested for drug crimes, as other scholars have noted, a similar kind of process here.
Okay, what? All right. So, first of all, freedom is constrained. That's been given since the idea of freedom has been populated into our idealistic world, right? You have to have some constraints on freedom. There is no system that I know of outside of anarchy and even anarchy has a set of norms and values that have to be established for it to work in general, right? Like anarcho-capitalism has to have market structures and valuations, stuff like that. Anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism has to have certain evaluated structures and certain beliefs. The metaphysical manifestation of class consciousness rising, that in and of itself is a rule of value, a structure that has to be followed. Neoliberalism has a rule of value and a structure that has to be followed, and nowhere has anyone ever said that freedom should just be unadulterated to go out there and do what you want. Because, again, the opposite of her argument is that murder is totally legal, murder is totally fine, you should just go out and be able to do it. Next, this weird sex trafficking thing. All right. So, would you rather be prostituted out and sex trafficked, or go to prison where you can receive an education, um, food, and the ability to build some semblance of resources? I think it would be easy to choose the prison over the sex trafficking and violence associated with that. And I don't you work with sex trafficked women, and yet you cannot understand the psycho and sociological pain that is associated with that. And you think that somehow prison is the antithesis of freedom, without considering that freedom is relative to the situation because it is a comparison. I think someone may think that prison in the United States is more free than working in a place that they have been sex trafficked and sold at whatever age. And to say that somehow that is the big evil, and that because we have a constraining function on freedom, that's a paradox. That's not a paradox. That's you being horrifyingly abstract about what freedom is and about what the pains that individuals go through when they've been sex trafficked. And yeah, that's, I don't know. That's just strange to me. Uh, to think that without freedom, you're going to have those with power is going with absolute freedom. You're going to have those with power, whether it's physical or economic or anything like that, are going to just prey upon those who are weaker than them. And so you have to have constraints to freedom.
And in many ways, I think she is the perfect neoliberal subject, right? You're self-managing, you're self-responsible, and you are seeking for self-advancement. But because she is a sex worker, so she immediately is targeted and regulated and policed as a trafficking victim, well, or a prostitute, depending on what agenda do you have in encountering with her.
What agenda could you possibly have to go, this person's being sexually trafficked? You could look at it and go, wow, this person's being sexually trafficked. That's not an agenda. You can have the conversation about prostitution, but again, to throw in sex trafficking victims as a modus operandi of some type of cultural hegemon to hold down other countries or to instantiate Western neoliberal beliefs, that's sickening, because it doesn't make any sense, and two, it delegitimizes any conversation that you can or may have about the problems of sex trafficking, which is a serious problem, and I think we can all agree is terrible. Which I guess we don't all agree that it's terrible. Some people, I don't want to put words in their mouth. They seem very apologetic towards it.
So, that is the one thing. That's why I think that victims of sex trafficking are very often the marks of the limits of neoliberalism, or the sexual limits of neoliberalism. So, in this seemingly amoral system, there is a strong moral agenda, especially a sexual agenda, and it is about a middle class, domestic sexual relationship and supposedly egalitarian partnership, and selling sex just violates that.
Again, we're equivocating prostitution, which several neoliberal quote unquote countries legalize prostitution, but you're equivocating that with sex trafficking. These are people forced to sell their body under the guise of an owner, right? even from a Marxist standpoint, this is absurd that you would validate any argument that allows for this. Okay, so first of all, let's just say that neoliberalism is trying to commodify everything or reify from the Frankfurt School. An individual has their own moral system, and the totality of this turns into voting, and it turns into your aggregate moral system. Now, you can say the aggregate moral system of the United States is what? Neoliberalism? Well, first of all, that's not true. If you look at the data, it's not true. There's a reason why we have this Cartesian plane for belief systems, because you can have one set of beliefs for economic freedom, and then you have another set of beliefs for your taste for authoritarianism from your government, right? Because you can have those with class consciousness on economics also disagree with the class consciousness of something like we need more, government involvement. You can say, no, I want a more equal economic system, but I also don't want, the government having harsher penalties for said crimes. That's not a paradox. Next, we have to think about this from the absolute standpoint of how people perceive the world. To say that most people aren't going to go, I think sex trafficking is bad, regardless of whether it's being commodified in favor of neoliberalism. I am still within my own structured moral framework say this is wrong, and I don't want this commodified. Therefore, it's not a paradox of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism, as we'd already kind of glanced over earlier, is saying it's an amoral system. So your morals influence what that system does. And so if everyone goes, okay, sex trafficking is objectively, or you could say subjectively, which one of these days I'm going to do a video on Danheim and objective versus subjective through hermeneutics. But anyway, we're going to say that this is quote unquote objectively, because it's going to be voted on. It's going to have the median voter rule that everyone thinks that, okay, this is where the buck stops. All right, we're not going to be trafficking women. That does not pose a paradox or an internal contradiction of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism does not reflect that in its own discourse. It is a function of the population's moral system. And if the population's moral system says it's bad, which again is a Western structure, if that's what's being attacked here. But anyway, this is just really weird to me. I've never seen someone do apologetics for sex trafficking in such a way. And I can understand the argument for prostitution. I get that. There's actually plenty of neoliberal arguments for prostitution, for legalizing of prostitution. But I don't know of any arguments made for legalizing sex trafficking, because it destroys individual liberty, which is the basis of neoliberalism. So again, it's not paradoxical. It's completely within the realms of what neoliberalism is trying to push forth. Yeah, weird, kind of scary actually.
And we need to domesticate sex.
We don't need to domesticate sex. That's just, I don't know why they would say that.
Individuals, through changes in the structure of retirement and Social Security processes, have been called upon to do their own work, take care of themselves financially and into the future, to think about the future. You don't count on a pension. You actually have to figure out how you're going to have enough money to live when you're old. And then, of course, there's an enormous commodification of financial services and financial tools. All those calculators and systems for keeping your accounts online, and technologies for managing. Even if you have very little money, you're still supposed to manage it and budget it and figure it out. And it's it is highly class differentiated. So payday loans on the one hand, and then all sorts of elaborate, individual retirement accounts and financial services for people who are wealthier. But we're all supposed to be engaged in these processes, and it's actually highly gendered. Women have been told, for the last couple decades at least, that they're bad at it, that they're particularly bad at it. I mean, you have had recently this whole narrative of women being irresponsible, specifically irresponsible about money, either shopaholics, either not able to manage money in that way, or passive and paralyzed, just afraid of dealing with the whole problem of investments. And in between that, the sort of appropriately healthy, probably male, rational money manager. So they're, sort of mobilizing of gender stereotypes to promote the called for personal financial self-management.
Okay, before this continues, so first of all, this paradox is by far the single most incomprehensible thing ever. And as you can see, this one, so far, it has explained zero about risk, because you're not making an argument for the risk itself within the financial industry. That's weird. All right, so first of all, people need to have responsibility for their future. How terrible, how horrible. All right. A lot going on here. The commodification of financial services and the financial tools. What does this mean? What does this do? All right, so commodification is a Marxist term about turning goods and services that don't necessarily need a consumption pattern to be turned into this consumer product, so on and so forth, right? So in the Frankfurt School, call it the reification, so on and so forth. There's a lot of work that's been done in the commodification, and they try to sneak it in there like it sounds like a term that you would learn in finance or economics, but it's not. It specifically comes from the Frankfurt School and knowing what commodification is. Now, with that, so why did things become commodified from the economic sense in the financial services? Well, first and foremost, it allows the distribution of risk throughout society rather than on individuals and individual firms, which means you're going to have less credit constraint through the commodification. And what I mean by less credit constraint is you're going to be more apt to give out credit because you're going to have to deal with less of that risk in and of it yourself. So that means the constraining function for credit is reduced. That was the whole purpose. That's why subprime mortgages and stuff like that was created and bundled and collateralized and done all of this. Now, it failed, obviously, for many reasons. Corporate governance structures, failures to forecast reductions and production mechanisms for houses due to the possibilities of lowering immigration and all of these things. There's just tons of things that went wrong for this. It was a perfect storm. It was like a 80 sigma whatever black swan, so on and so forth. There's 1,000 different names for what happened, but that's essentially what the commodification of financial services was done for. Second, what else does it do? Well, it allows loans and credit to not be personalized and make it more fair. Because let's say 30 years ago, you used to have to go to your bank. You go to your bank, you sit there, you talk to that guy. He figures it out. That loan guy, he figures it out whether he wants to give you a loan or not. Now, if he doesn't like you for your race, gender, creed, etc., then he will deny you the loan, and it's based on personal attributes of your personhood that have nothing to do with whether you can pay back the loan or not. So he can discriminate under that. Now, what happens is we said, okay, we got to start removing this because we want to get rid of discrimination. So now we create a different discriminatory barrier for this, but we said, okay, this is going to be it's not going to be anything to do with your race or your color or your creed. We're going to make it about your credit rating. And then we're going to look at your prior values, your prior assets, stuff like that. We're going to evaluate it. Then we're going to run a model. This is going to be our loss model to figure out whether you're high on whether you're going to foreclose or not and stuff like that. And then if you meet the certain parameters within this model, boom, you get the loan. No ifs, ands, or buts. Doesn't matter what your color, creed, or race is. Now, what did this do? This did have a equity versus fairness problem. So there's plenty of arguments out there to be made that, doing this actually removed a lot of people who could have gotten loans because they knew the banker, because they knew the system and they knew the people, and the people were like, well, I can vouch for him. He may have had a bad time in life, but I can vouch for him now, and I trust him now, even though I don't care about his past because he's a different person. I started going to church with him for 6 months, and I know the changes that he's made. And so there is that problem, and that problem does lead into less equity, right? Because you have to have this quantitative evaluation rather than this qualitative evaluation of an individual. Now, we're slowly but surely moving into introducing some of the qualitative factors into whether or not someone's going to get a loan. So we've already said, all right, so we've made it more fair. Now we can move into making it more equitable. And that's just a function of this financial commodification. And it doesn't move fast because nothing moves fast. Because you don't want to overcorrect to the point that you're having serious problems. Which is something that we had. We had serious problems from the subprime mortgages by following this kind of thinking about increasing the level of equity amongst individuals versus the fairness. And so this is just a simple idea. All right. So next is, this payday loan versus these elaborate financial tools that can be utilized. First and foremost, this is not a mutually exclusive argument for class. You can have money through a financial advisor, financial management scheme that goes to your retirement that you can't touch because it's part of your retirement. And if you pull it out, it's going to get heavily taxed and stuff like that. So you won't be able to actually touch that. And so you have to make a decision on whether or not you want to pull from that or go get a payday loan. This is not a mutually exclusive argument. It is not a gendered argument. It is not a race-based argument. This is simply just completely fallacious, right? Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. Now, highly gendered roles of finance. Again, this is a complete and utter lie. This is a flat out lie. Shopaholics, first and foremost, you said that women are called shopaholics all the time. That's because of the people that we've estimated to be shopaholics. 92% are female. In the U.S., women control about 85% of all consumer purchases. This is not a radically new trend. This has been throughout most of human history that women have controlled finances, depending on the regime, right? So the Norse, the women controlled all the finances because they were considered lucky. And they were considered to have forecasting powers, so that's why women controlled it. And then, this kind of integration of these Nordic beliefs into England as well as throughout the rest of Europe also shaped that to be a part of European culture where women typically control the money in the household. Even if they're not the ones who earn it, they typically control it. Yeah. Now, 93% of women have stated that they have significant influence on what financial services their family purchases. So, and again, all of this goes back well before the 2008 crisis. The 2008 crisis was not a paradigm of male versus female or individual versus social risk responsibilities. This was essentially just poor government structure poor governance structure of corporations, poor valuations and risk models, poor forecasting abilities because economics is hard to forecast in general. It is a dynamic and complex system. Um, Bubbles, whether you're part of the efficient market hypothesis or whether you're from the reflexivity school or whether you're a part of the Austrian school, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's extremely, extremely hard to beat all of this back and to say that you have the answer, and it's because of the male model of rational financial investment, and that women were considered, not investors and stuff like that, despite the fact that the first investments of women and the first stock market for women, I think it came out like 1852 or 1892, somewhere along those lines, you know, even really before the major stock market boom in general in the United States. And they've been a significant portion of it. The only thing that you're going to be pointing to right here, so we'll let her finish.
That's flipped a little bit since the financial crisis. All of a sudden now, women's risk aversion, what used to look like anxious passivity, is all of a sudden a sort of smart risk aversion, and where men are now, it's now the fault of testosterone that we had the financial crisis, right? So men are being, made crazy by their hormones, and women are the rational ones, whereas it was presumably women's hormones that were the problem before. So we've had a little reversal in the evaluation, but the gender stereotypes are actually the same. So in terms of, personal finance, we've really seen gender stereotypes mobilized in support of particular norms of personal financial self-management.
All right, so so your initial discussion was about risk, and you managed to turn it into something about gendered constructs that had absolutely nothing to do with the entire point of how risk is considered self-responsible and depoliticized, and yet we live on a regime of fear. None of your argument had anything to do with that. It didn't substantiate it. It didn't negate it. It didn't do anything. It was just random. And I don't think this lady actually understood the question, I'm assuming, because she completely missed the ball. Also, this passive paralyzed investments, and then we've had this switch from the male rational to the female rational now when it comes to investment strategies. There is no good reason to believe that women and men have different tastes for risk aversion. That is possibly cultural and possibly individualistic. It has nothing to do with gender. The only thing that you can point to, and this has nothing to do with about the risk assessment that an individual is taking, men would tend towards growth and comparatives because competition's male, or women tend to choose stuff like long-term growth set up for like their children to go to college. But that has nothing to do with the level of risk aversion. That is a goal that is being sought after. It doesn't change your level of risk aversion. That's nonsense. And there's no good level of reasoning or empirical evidence that I know of that's been controlled for and kept constant over time and all of these things that legitimizes this belief of risk aversion as a gendered construct. Because if it was, then you would have to agree that there's not gender, that there's biological sex, which I don't think that this individual would. So what's going on here? I don't, it's incomprehensible. It's just nonsense.
It's very difficult, starting with your sort of average audience in the United States, to explain what the problem with free trade is, right? What could be wrong with free trade? And in order to explain what's wrong with free trade, you do need a longer history of colonialism in order to explain how it is that stronger economies extract resources from weaker economies.
So, to explain the problems of free trade, you have to look at a system that has nothing to do with free trade. Awesome. Got it. Thanks.
And how freedom of trade can actually exacerbate inequality. You really need to understand the history of empire in order to understand how that works, like the way that labor, land, and raw materials have circulated, been grabbed by or circulated to richer economies and been sucked out of poorer ones. You have to understand that in order to get how a policy like free trade could be extracting resources rather than kind of existing in a fair, balanced trading field, which is the imaginary of free trade, right? Free trade, oh, that means everybody just gets to buy and sell what they want to, and nobody's going to try to put a stop to it. What that has meant historically is that stronger economies move in and put local economies out of business and take resources and profits out of those countries and end up dominating economies in poorer countries in a way that makes it difficult for those economies to develop in ways that actually support the local populations, because so many resources are being sent out by the via policies of so-called free trade means unregulated, so that the poorer economy then is not allowed to protect its own industries so that it can grow, or to prevent foreign interests from coming in and taking profits and things right out of the country.
Okay, we're moving up on an hour. I'm going to answer this and then we'll run back through. Because I don't think anybody's going to sit here for an hour. I mean, I hope you do, but it is what it is. All right, so let's jump into this. So first and foremost, free trade is extractive. Free trade is extractive on both ends. We figured this out in the 70s and 80s with the new trade theory development, right? This is Paul Krugman and stuff like that, where we started making arguments for the infant industry and stuff like that, looking at the growth of the United States, how it's utilized tariffs and stuff like that. This is not new. I don't know who you're arguing with. This is you tilting at windmills, complete straw man. No one's saying the opposite outside of, a few ideologues, but no one really listens to them anyway, because public policy isn't presented by ideologues. Public policy is presented by people within the system, and most people within the trade theory system are new trade or new trade theorists. They're not quoting the Heckscher-Lean model. That's just not happening. No one's saying that there's no extraction that happens from free trade. And we knew this when we went in with NAFTA, with the TPP, and all of these other trades. They are not unfettered, unregulated trade agreements. The unfettered, unregulated trade agreements happen, like binationally. So like very small sets of free trade agreements. Like the largest free trade agreement in the world is the European Union, but there is obviously regulations within that say you can't do this, you can't do that, so on and so forth. For you to be within the system, to use the euro, you have to match your fiscal policy to all the other countries' fiscal policy so that we have stabilization from monetary policy, which obviously didn't work. You have to have your internal monetary policy match that of the ECB. That didn't work, but that was the guiding structure that was behind, and that didn't work out too well. But to say that it's unregulated, unfettered free trade, that's not true. There hasn't been such an instance. We have the World Trade Organization that tries to maintain as many rules as possible to facilitate free trade without it being extractive, because we know that that's bad. And we've known that's bad for years. Is there a positive that comes from free trade for both countries? Yes. Is there a negative that happens for both countries? Yeah. Look at what happened with the United States when it came to NAFTA and a few of the other free trade agreements, right? The extractive property of collapsing these basic sectors in, like the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, which, like Detroit, Michigan, in my video for basic sectors, collapsed Detroit by the by the ruination of their basic sector, and it being transplanted into the places that we were trading with. So did that benefit them or did that benefit us? I mean, obviously it caused damage and harm to us as well. So sure, we know that free trade unregulated is somehow not perfect. And yet we don't do it. And we have never done it. I mean, maybe back in the day, and even then, mercantilism was still pretty prevalent. But I love that all of this comes down to just simply not knowing the economic literature, not understanding what economics says and does, completely disregarding the difference between colonialism and trade agreements and free trade, as if somehow those are synonymous, which obviously they're not. You can tell the difference. And by the way, free trade doesn't mean unregulated. It means unregulated access to markets and market information. That is different than unregulated in general. That doesn't mean you can use economic coercion to force a country to trade with you. You can't do that, even though that would necessarily be a part of free trade. And again, they keep equivocating words. They keep trying to do everything they can to lie, and it's kind of gross. Anyway, I'll have another video finishing this up, probably out tomorrow. We've only got 5 minutes left. This one's already been an hour, so hopefully that one gets cut short a little bit. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy watching. The Economancer is out.